Preface, The Secret and the Update. This edition opens with two voices, and the tension between them explains the whole book. Arthur Pell, writing in 2004, says that revising Think and Grow Rich is like restoring a classic painting. Napoleon Hill's basic philosophy must remain Hill's, but examples that spoke to readers of the 1930s can be replaced with figures a later reader recognizes: Bill Gates, Mary Kay Ash, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ray Kroc, Michael Jordan, and others. The promise on the cover, then, is not a new principle for the 21st century. It is the old architecture with updated windows. Hill remains the author. Pell is the editor who changes some illustrations while preserving the machine underneath. Hill's own preface introduces that machine as a secret Andrew Carnegie placed in his mind when Hill was young. Carnegie asked him to spend decades interviewing successful people and reducing their experience to a formula ordinary readers could use. Hill insists the secret is mentioned again and again, but never pinned down too early. It has to be recognized, not handed over. That is part of the book's method. The reader is supposed to become alert, to search, to test each chapter against a definite desire of their own. Hill names hundreds of industrialists, inventors, presidents, lawyers, merchants, and reformers as evidence that the same invisible pattern keeps appearing. He is not writing a neutral textbook. He is writing a practical success creed, full of confidence, metaphysics, salesmanship, and Depression-era urgency. That matters for a modern breakdown. Some claims will sound extravagant, and some belong plainly to the vocabulary of their period, but the preface asks us to read the book as a system of disciplined attention. Find one definite aim, feed it with belief, translate it into plans, and protect it from fear. The preface also gives the book's first clue in plain sight. All achievement, all earned riches have their beginning in an idea. If the reader is ready, Hill says, the other half of the secret will meet that idea somewhere in the mind. Chapter 1. The Power of Thought. Hill begins with a sentence that sounds like a slogan but functions as his thesis. Thoughts are things, when they are mixed with purpose, persistence, and burning desire. Edwin Barnes proves it first. He arrives at Thomas Edison's laboratory with no money, no influence, and no real opening, but with one exact thought in his mind. He wants to work with Edison, not for him. The chance does not appear at once. Barnes takes lowly work, waits, watches, and keeps the desire alive until the ignored Edison dictating machine becomes his door. Other salesmen see a poor product. Barnes sees the opportunity he has been waiting for and turns it into a national business under the slogan, made by Edison and installed by Barnes. Then Hill turns the same principle from desire to defeat. Darby and his uncle quit a Colorado mine 3 feet from gold because they lacked expert counsel. The junk man who buys their equipment calls in an engineer, follows the vein, and makes millions. Darby carries the lesson into insurance sales and learns that no does not always mean no. A sharecropper's child teaches him the same thing in miniature when she stands down an angry adult and keeps saying, her mother has to have 50 cents. For Hill, the power is not stubborn noise. It is a mind so organized by a definite purpose that temporary defeat cannot persuade it to quit. The chapter then widens through Henry Ford, who orders his engineers to cast a V8 engine block they call impossible, and through Pell's modern examples. Bill Gates leaves Harvard to build Microsoft around the belief that computers will sit on every desk and in every home. Steven Spielberg sneaks off the Universal Studios tour, makes himself visible, survives the disappointment of the Sugarland Express, and fights to direct Jaws. The examples vary, but the pattern is one. The dominant thought magnetizes action, people, and opportunity until an idea starts taking physical form. Hill's rhetoric is mystical, but his narrative pattern is concrete. The mind keeps noticing what matches its ruling aim, and because it notices, it acts where other people drift past. Barnes sees a machine others dismiss. Darby sees a sales refusal differently after losing a mine. Ford hears impossible and converts it into an instruction. That is the practical force hidden inside the phrase thoughts are things. Chapter 2. Desire, the starting point of all achievement. Desire is not wishing. That is Hill's first distinction. Barnes did not merely hope to become Edison's associate. He burned the bridges behind him and lived as if that association were already his destiny. Hill piles up scenes to make the point. A warrior burns the ships so his soldiers have no route home except victory. Marshall Field stands among the smoking ruins after the Chicago fire and vows to build the world's greatest store on the same spot. Desire becomes effective when retreat is removed. Hill then gives the famous 6 steps. Name the exact amount of money desired, decide what will be given in return, set a date, make a definite plan, write the statement, and read it aloud morning and night while seeing and feeling the result as already real. The language is extreme, but the structure is practical. Desire becomes measurable, reciprocal, timed, written, visualized, and acted upon. Pell's updated examples show the same pattern in later lives. Ray Kroc sees the McDonald brothers' small restaurant and imagines a system that can scale. Arnold Schwarzenegger moves from bodybuilding to books, movies, business, and politics by setting new goals after each triumph. Mary Kay Ash transforms a missed promotion and a notebook of sales principles into a cosmetics company built on recognition and self-belief. Hill's most personal example is his son Blair, born without visible ears and expected to be deaf and mute. Hill refuses to accept that verdict, plants in the child a desire to hear and speak, and later sees Blair use a hearing device and then work to help others who are hard of hearing. The chapter's risk is obvious. Hill speaks as if desire can conquer almost anything. Its more careful lesson is that desire, when definite and fed daily by faith, can organize attention, endurance, imagination, and service around a goal. This is why the 6 steps matter so much to the rest of the book. They turn a craving into a contract with the self. A vague hope can be postponed forever. A written amount, date, exchange, and plan makes the reader answer for the desire every morning and every night. Desire becomes a practice, not an occasional mood. Chapter 3. Faith, Visualizing and Believing in the Attainment of Desire. Faith, for Hill, is not merely religious assent. It is the state of mind that gives life and direction to desire. He calls it the head chemist of the mind because thought has to be emotionalized before the subconscious will act on it. The practical mechanism is repetition. What a person repeats, pictures, and feels eventually becomes belief, whether constructive or destructive. That is why Hill places the self-confidence formula at the center of the chapter. The reader writes a definite purpose, promises persistent action, spends time imagining the person they intend to become, and commits to transactions that benefit everyone involved. The point is not empty optimism. Hill is trying to train the mind to stop rehearsing failure and start rehearsing a chosen identity. But he also insists the same law works negatively. Fear, doubt, and poverty thoughts can become commands too, if they dominate the mind. To illustrate faith as collective power, Hill turns to Gandhi, whose lack of money, weapons, and official force did not prevent him from coordinating millions of people around a shared conviction. Pell adds Martin Luther King, whose civil rights leadership translated faith in human dignity into public action. Then comes the long business example, Charles Schwab's after-dinner speech that helped create United States Steel. Schwab takes an idea, mixes it with faith, gives it a plan, persuades Morgan and Carnegie, and turns industrial imagination into a corporation worth hundreds of millions. Pell later adds John Templeton, the investor whose disciplined confidence let him buy when others were afraid. The chapter's central claim is that belief is not decoration added after a plan. It is the force that lets a plan survive fear long enough to be acted upon. The chapter also explains why Hill returns so often to emotion. He does not think reason alone moves people. A cold statement stays inert, while a statement mixed with feeling becomes a command to the whole person. Whether that is described as psychology, prayer, or infinite intelligence, the lesson inside the system is that a desire must be believed vividly enough to change conduct. Chapter 4. Autosuggestion, the medium for influencing the subconscious mind. Hill now names the channel through which desire and faith are supposed to reach the deeper mind, autosuggestion or self-suggestion. The conscious mind is an outer guard. It can pass thoughts down to the subconscious or reject them. If it neglects that work, the subconscious becomes a garden where weeds grow by default. This is why Hill sends the reader back to the 6 steps from desire. Reading the written statement is not magic. Plain words, repeated without feeling, do nothing. The words have to be mixed with emotion, belief, and concentration until the mind begins to treat the goal as real. Hill's instructions are concrete. Go somewhere quiet, close your eyes, read the exact amount, the deadline, the service you will give in return, and then imagine possession of the money while expecting a plan to appear. Once a plan comes, act at once. In the language of the book, the plan may arrive as inspiration from infinite intelligence. In more practical terms, Hill is training attention to keep asking for usable plans instead of vague wishes. He warns that cleverness alone will not hold money, and that occasional effort is not the price. The price is persistence in the ritual until it becomes habit. Autosuggestion is the hinge of the system. Desire supplies the object, faith supplies the feeling, imagination supplies plans, and repeated self-instruction keeps the whole pattern before the subconscious mind. Hill also insists that the reader must imagine the service or merchandise given in exchange, not merely the money received. That detail keeps the ritual tied to value. Autosuggestion, in this chapter, is not supposed to be fantasy detached from contribution. It is a repeated rehearsal of purpose, payment, service, and action until the mind starts looking for a practical route. Chapter 5. Specialized knowledge, personal experiences or observations. Hill attacks one of the most familiar slogans in education. Knowledge is power. Knowledge, he says, is only potential power. It becomes power only when organized into definite plans and directed toward a definite end. Henry Ford is his courtroom example. Lawyers try to embarrass Ford with general history questions, and Ford answers that if he needs facts he can press the right button and call people who know them. Education, in Hill's definition, is not possession of every fact. It is the ability to draw out, organize, and use whatever knowledge a purpose requires, often through a mastermind. Andrew Carnegie did not need to know every technical detail of steel because he knew how to coordinate people who did. Pell modernizes the point with Dave Thomas of Wendy's, a school dropout who later earned his high school diploma and used his own example to urge young people to keep learning. Specialized knowledge can come from experience, colleges, libraries, evening classes, distance learning, the internet, and the cooperation of other people. But it has to be marketed. Hill tells of a laid-off grocery salesman who studies accounting and builds a mobile bookkeeping service for small merchants. He tells of a woman who prepares a detailed plan book to sell her son's services, winning him a junior executive job at the salary he names. He tells of Dan Halpin, who refuses to stay in an unwanted commission job and rises rapidly by aiming at a better position. Pell adds Michael Jordan, whose specialized preparation keeps him championship ready even after critics say he is past his prime. The lesson is not that school is useless. It is that knowledge must be selected, organized, applied, and sold in service of a definite aim. This is why Hill spends so much time on marketing personal services. People often ask for a job as if the employer should discover their value. Hill reverses the burden. Study the buyer, prepare the case, show what you can give, and present your knowledge as a plan that solves the other person's problem. Specialized knowledge becomes valuable when someone can see exactly how it will be used. Chapter 6. Imagination, the workshop of the mind. Desire is still abstract until imagination gives it shape. Hill divides imagination into two forms. Synthetic imagination rearranges old ideas, facts, and plans into new combinations. Creative imagination receives hunches, inspirations, and original ideas. The language is metaphysical, but the practical point is clear. A plan is the bridge between wanting and doing, and the bridge is built in the imagination. Hill wants the reader to write the plan down because written form begins to turn an invisible impulse into something that can be revised and acted on. Then he gives stories of ideas becoming money. The enchanted kettle is Coca-Cola. A doctor sells a formula and an old kettle to the drug clerk Asa Candler for $500. The formula matters, but Hill says the missing ingredient is imagination, the ability to turn syrup, bottles, advertising, distribution, and public desire into a world business. Frank Gonzalez offers the second example. For 2 years, he dreams of a practical college but does nothing. Then he decides he will raise $1 million within a week, announces a sermon called What I Would Do If I Had $1 Million, speaks without his notes, and attracts Philip Armour, who funds the Armour Institute. The late edition adds Southwest Airlines. Roland King has the initial idea for a low-cost Texas airline, but Herb Kelleher becomes the seller and defender of the idea through years of court fights, 10-minute turnarounds, open seating, word of mouth, and customer service. Hill's formula is blunt. Ideas can be transmuted into cash through definite purpose plus definite plans. Imagination is where the purpose gets designed well enough to move. Hill also makes a warning by contrast. Hard work and honesty alone do not guarantee riches in his system. They need an idea, and the idea needs a seller who can make other people recognize its value. That is why Candler, Gonzalez, Kelleher, and Carnegie matter together. Each connects a creator, a plan, and a market. Imagination is not daydreaming. It is commercial architecture. Chapter 7. Organized Planning. The Crystallization of Desire into Action. This is the book's longest practical chapter because Hill is no longer content with desire, belief, and imagination. A fortune needs a plan that can survive contact with reality. The first instruction is to form a mastermind alliance. Choose the people whose knowledge, experience, and imagination are needed. Decide what you can give them in return, meet often, and preserve harmony. No great plan, Hill says, should remain the private invention of one mind. It must be checked and improved by allied minds. Hill is unusually specific here because the alliance has to do real work. The members should be chosen for knowledge, experience, and imagination, not for status. They should meet often enough to keep the plan alive, and each person should know what compensation, material or otherwise, makes cooperation fair. Harmony is not decoration. Without it, the alliance becomes a committee of competing egos instead of a mastermind. If a plan fails, replace it. Temporary defeat means the plan is unsound, not that the purpose is dead. Edison failed thousands of times before the light bulb. Ford met temporary defeat and kept rebuilding. A quitter never wins, and a winner never quits. From there, Hill turns planning toward the sale of services. Almost everyone who begins without property has ideas or service to offer, so they must learn to market themselves. He distinguishes leaders from followers, then lists the attributes of leadership: courage, self-control, justice, definite decision, definite plans, more service than paid for, pleasing personality, sympathy, mastery of detail, responsibility, and cooperation. He rejects leadership by force and argues for leadership by consent. The chapter is very much of its era in its defense of capital and the law of economics, but its operational center is QQS: quality, quantity, and the spirit of cooperation. The person selling services is a merchant whose product is their own ability, and the public is the final employer. The negative lists are just as important as the positive ones. Hill attacks leaders who cannot organize details, who expect pay for what they know rather than what they do, who fear competition from capable followers, who lack imagination, who claim credit for other people's work, or who rely on authority instead of service. Those lists can feel severe, but they keep the chapter from becoming mere enthusiasm. Planning, for Hill, is a discipline of correction. Hill also gives hard diagnostic lists, major causes of leadership failure, major causes of personal failure, and an annual self-analysis. Beneath all that detail sits one message. Desire crystallizes into action only when it is converted into organized plans, tested by others, adjusted after defeat, and delivered as useful service. That is also why the chapter's lists are useful even when they feel severe. Hill is forcing the reader to inspect the machinery of action. The allies, the compensation, the leadership habits, the market for services, the causes of failure, and the yearly audit. Desire becomes serious only when it accepts this amount of detail. This is also the point at which Think and Grow Rich becomes less mystical and more managerial. The earlier chapters teach the reader to want, believe, imagine, and repeat. This chapter asks whether the desire can survive budgets, roles, meetings, rejection, buyer psychology, leadership defects, and a yearly accounting of behavior. For Hill, organized planning is the place where a wish either becomes a working enterprise or exposes itself as only talk. Chapter 8. Decision, the Mastery of Procrastination. Hill treats indecision as one of the great invisible causes of failure. People who accumulate fortunes, he says, reach decisions promptly and change them slowly. People who fail reach decisions slowly and change them quickly. Henry Ford becomes the business example. His refusal to abandon the Model T eventually becomes obstinacy. But before that point, the same firmness makes him rich. Hill prefers the danger of being too firm to the paralysis of listening to every opinion. Opinions, he says, are the cheapest commodities on earth. The reader should keep a closed mouth, open ears and eyes, and take counsel only from the mastermind allies who are in harmony with the purpose. Then Hill raises the stakes with political history. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Socrates drinking poison, General Lee choosing the South, and especially the Declaration of Independence all become examples of decisions that carried mortal risk. Hill's version of the American Revolution emphasizes a small mastermind. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, and the Committee of Correspondence. A decision in Boston leads to organized correspondence, then to Congress, then to Lee's motion, then to Jefferson's declaration, then to 56 signatures that could have been death warrants. The point is not a history lesson for its own sake. Hill wants decision to feel like an act of courage, not a preference. Pell's modern example is Fred Smith, who sees that passenger airline routes are wrong for freight, raises $91 million for Federal Express despite skepticism, builds a Memphis hub, survives early losses, and keeps improving the system. Decision is the cut that turns desire into commitment. Without it, plans remain talk. Hill's rule about secrecy also belongs here. He is not praising isolation. The mastermind still matters. He is warning against scattering a fresh purpose among casual opinions before it has strength. Facts are useful. Ridicule and gossip are not. A decision needs information, but it also needs protection while it hardens into action. Chapter 9. Persistence. The sustained effort necessary to induce faith. Persistence is the willpower that keeps desire from cooling into a wish. Hill says most people throw their aims overboard at the first sign of opposition, while the few who keep going become the Fords, Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Edisons. The quality may not sound heroic, but it is to character what carbon is to steel. Hill's test is practical. If the reader does not actually carry out the 6 steps from the desire chapter, then the desire is still weak. Weak desires bring weak results. The remedy is to build a stronger fire under the desire and make the practices habitual. He uses a nightmare image. You wake half paralyzed, move one finger, then an arm, then a leg, and finally snap out of it step by step. Mental inertia, he says, can be broken the same way. Pell updates the theme through Bruce Lee, who loses the starring role in Kung Fu, nearly gives up, then persists in film until martial arts become part of global popular culture. Hill then gives the anatomy of persistence: definiteness of purpose, desire, self-reliance, definite plans, accurate knowledge, cooperation, willpower, and habit. He also lists the symptoms of its absence: vague wants, procrastination, alibis, passing the buck, compromising with poverty, wishing instead of willing, and fear of criticism. Fred Smith returns as an example of refusing criticism. Tom Monahan rebuilds Domino's after the sale nearly ruins it, then drops the 30-minute guarantee after lawsuits and keeps the company moving. Howard Schultz loses money for years while building Starbucks into an American version of the Italian coffee bar. The chapter reduces success to a rhythm: definite purpose, definite plan, a mind closed against discouragement, and allies who help you follow through. Persistence is therefore not mere endurance. It is the repeated renewal of the whole system. Desire keeps the goal hot, plans keep the effort concrete, autosuggestion keeps the mind trained, and the mastermind keeps discouragement from becoming final. Hill's harshest enemy is not failure itself. It is the moment when a person uses failure as permission to stop thinking, stop planning, and start explaining. Chapter 10. Power of the Mastermind, the Driving Force. Plans are inert until power carries them into action. Hill defines power as organized and intelligently directed knowledge. The key word is organized. Knowledge can come from accumulated experience, experiment, and research, and, in Hill's spiritual vocabulary, infinite intelligence. But none of it becomes power until it is coordinated into action. This is why the mastermind returns as the driving force of the system. Two or more people coordinating knowledge and effort in a spirit of harmony for a definite purpose. Hill gives it two meanings. Economically, it is obvious. A cooperative group gives advice, skill, contacts, and labor no isolated person possesses. Psychically, Hill imagines a third mind, an invisible force created by harmony between minds. Whether one accepts the metaphysics or not, the business claim is direct. Carnegie attributes his fortune to a staff of roughly 50 men who made and sold steel with him. Ford grows through friendships with Edison, Firestone, Burroughs, and Burbank. Franklin Roosevelt forms a brain trust. Gandhi turns 200 million people into a coordinated moral force without weapons. Pell updates the principle with Andrew Grove at Intel, where demanding autonomous teams help solve crises, including the costly Pentium chip replacement, and with Ross Perot at Electronic Data Systems, where a small committed team beats IBM on a major contract after Perot writes 7 criteria on a blackboard and tells them they will win 7-0. The chapter's core is cooperation without drift. Money is shy, Hill says, and must be wooed by desire, faith, persistence, a plan, and action. The mastermind supplies the organized power that lets those forces move together. Hill's repeated demand for harmony is important. He does not mean politeness only. He means a group cannot become a mastermind while its members secretly pull in different directions, hoard credit, or undermine one another. The economic advantage of the group depends on trust, shared purpose, and the willingness to let another person's knowledge strengthen your own plan. Chapter 11. The Mystery of Sex Transmutation. This is the most dated and delicate chapter in the book, and it needs to be heard as Hill's success philosophy, not as modern psychology. By transmutation, he means redirecting a powerful drive from physical expression into creative work. Hill argues that sex desire is the strongest human stimulus, and that when it is disciplined rather than suppressed, it can become imagination, courage, persistence, personal magnetism, art, business energy, and leadership. He lists 10 mind stimuli: sex, love, desire for fame or money, music, friendship, the mastermind, mutual suffering, autosuggestion, fear, and narcotics or alcohol. 8 are constructive or natural. 2 are destructive. His larger claim is that genius appears when intense emotion raises the mind above routine thought and lets creative imagination work. He uses Elmer Gates sitting in a dark room for ideas, Edison testing thousands of combinations, and Lincoln strengthened by love, after and Rutledge. He also argues that many people do not reach their strongest productive period until after 40 because they gradually learn to channel emotion with more control. The practical chapter is less about sex itself than about the management of emotional energy. Hill praises love, romance, and sex as an achievement triangle when balanced. Love gives steadiness, romance gives color, and sex gives intensity. In his vocabulary, the 3 together can lift ambition above routine appetite. That framing is dated, especially because Hill generalizes from the lives of successful men, but it explains why the chapter sits in a book about achievement rather than private morality. He is trying to describe how strong feeling gets converted into stamina, charm, imagination, and productive pressure. He warns that jealousy, overindulgence, resentment, alcohol, and drugs can poison judgment. The language is sweeping, and some claims are plainly products of his time. Still, inside the chapter is a usable idea. High energy must be guided. Desire without control scatters itself. Desire mixed with love, discipline, imagination, and purpose becomes creative force. The chapter can feel uncomfortable because Hill generalizes from the lives of successful men and speaks about women mostly as sources of inspiration. A faithful reading should not hide that limitation. It should notice it, then keep the transferable point. Powerful emotion can either consume attention or be converted into sustained creative work. The strongest version of the chapter is therefore not a claim that genius depends on one drive alone. It is a warning that unmanaged intensity leaks into distraction, while disciplined intensity can be redirected into art, business, leadership, and long work. That is the transmutation Hill wants the reader to practice. Chapter 12. The Subconscious Mind, the Connecting Link. Hill now gathers the earlier principles around the subconscious mind. He pictures it as a filing cabinet that records every thought and sense impression, and as a channel between the finite mind and infinite intelligence. The reader cannot fully control it, he says, but can hand over plans, desires, and purposes that are mixed with emotion. This is why desire must be clear, written, repeated, imagined, and backed by faith. The subconscious works day and night. If the reader does not feed it chosen thoughts, it will feed on whatever arrives by neglect, fear, poverty, anger, jealousy, revenge, superstition, and worry. Hill lists 7 positive emotions: desire, faith, love, sex, enthusiasm, romance, and hope. He contrasts them with 7 negative emotions: fear, jealousy, hatred, revenge, greed, superstition, and anger. Positive and negative emotions cannot dominate the mind at the same time, so the practical task is habit. Build the habit of giving the mind the emotional material you want it to act upon. Even prayer, in Hill's theory, fails when it is only words filled with fear and doubt. It works when thought is carried by faith. Again, the metaphysical framework belongs to Hill, but the behavioral pattern is clear. The mind acts most strongly on thoughts that are emotionally charged, repeated, and made habitual. The chapter also clarifies why Hill distrusts cold reason by itself. Reason can analyze, but emotion moves. If the emotions are fear, anger, and greed, the movement is destructive. If the emotions are desire, faith, love, enthusiasm, and hope, they become the yeast that makes a thought active. The subconscious, as Hill describes it, is less persuaded by argument than by the emotional climate it receives every day. Chapter 13. The Brain, a broadcasting and receiving station for thought. The radio metaphor expands here. The brain, he says, broadcasts and receives thought vibrations. The subconscious mind sends, creative imagination receives, and autosuggestion starts the station operating. The comparison made sense in an age fascinated by wireless communication, and Pell's edition keeps it as part of Hill's system. Emotion is the amplifier. A thought mixed with strong feeling vibrates, in Hill's language, at a higher rate and is more likely to reach the subconscious or other minds. Then he turns from radio to the broader mystery of intangible forces. Gravity, electricity, soil fertility, ocean waves, and thought all shape human life, even though people do not fully understand them. The chapter quotes early brain research and newspaper discussion of telepathy experiments at Duke University, not to prove a modern neuroscience claim, but to support Hill's conviction that the mind contains capacities beyond the five senses. The most practical passage comes at the end, where Hill describes sitting with two members of his staff around a table, stating a problem clearly, and discussing it until ideas arrive from beyond any one person's experience. That is the mastermind in miniature. Even if the broadcasting theory feels antique, the method remains useful. State the problem, combine informed minds, raise the emotional seriousness of the work, and let collective thinking generate solutions no isolated person would have found. This also prepares the final chapter on the sixth sense. Hill is moving from personal discipline to receptive intelligence. Once desire, emotion, imagination, and cooperation are tuned together, ideas appear with a speed that feels as if they came from outside the ordinary self. He calls that broadcasting. A modern listener can call it prepared attention meeting collaborative thought. Chapter 14. The Sixth Sense, the Door to the Temple of Wisdom. Hill calls the sixth sense the apex of the philosophy, and he admits it cannot really be understood before the other 12 principles have been practiced. In his system, the sixth sense is the creative imagination at its highest point, the receiving set through which hunches, warnings, opportunities, and inspirations flash into the mind. He does not present it as a shortcut. It comes slowly through meditation, self-examination, experience, and disciplined use of the earlier principles. The main story is his imaginary council. Before sleep, Hill pictures 9 figures around a table: Emerson, Paine, Edison, Darwin, Lincoln, Burbank, Napoleon, Ford, and Carnegie. He addresses each one for a trait he wants to build into himself: Emerson's understanding of nature, Paine's courage of expression, Darwin's patience, Lincoln's justice, Carnegie's organized effort, Ford's persistence, Edison's faith. At first, the council is deliberate autosuggestion, a character-building exercise. Then, in Hill's telling, the figures grow vivid, speak unexpectedly, and become a source of ideas. He is careful to say the meetings are imaginary, yet he also gives them credit for guiding him through difficult problems. The chapter is strange, but its practical core is easier to translate. Choose models deliberately, study them closely, rehearse their virtues until they become available in your own conduct, and listen for the sudden combinations the prepared mind can produce. The sixth sense, in this careful reading, is Hill's name for intuition trained by desire, knowledge, imagination, self-discipline, and long attention. It is the least material chapter, but it completes the arc. The reader begins with money, then passes through desire, faith, plans, cooperation, fear, and self-mastery, and finally arrives at judgment. Hill wants a mind that can recognize danger and opportunity before they become obvious. His imaginary council is the dramatic symbol for that trained judgment. Chapter 15. How to Outwit the 6 Ghosts of Fear. Before the philosophy can work, Hill says the mind must be cleared of 3 related enemies: indecision, doubt, and fear. Indecision is the seedling. It hardens into doubt. Together they become fear. Hill names 6 basic fears: poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, and death. Poverty comes first because it can paralyze reason, imagination, initiative, enthusiasm, self-control, and ambition. Criticism destroys individuality and self-reliance, especially when parents or employers use it carelessly. Ill health becomes more dangerous when fear itself manufactures symptoms. Loss of love expresses itself through jealousy and suspicion. Old age frightens people into surrendering initiative just when later years might bring judgment and self-control. Death terrifies because it is unknown, but Hill advises accepting it as either transition or sleep and refusing to pay the price of worry. The chapter's most important sentence is simple: fears are states of mind. Hill is not denying real hardship. He is arguing that fear becomes a mental climate, and that climate can sabotage every plan before reality has a chance to test it. Worry is sustained fear, produced by indecision, and the cure is decision. Decide not to worry about poverty, criticism, illness, old age, lost love, or death. Decide what can be done, then do that. The whole chapter becomes preparation for self-command. A mind full of fear transmits fear to others and records fear inside its own character. A mind directed by purpose has at least one privilege no circumstance can take away: the power to choose the thoughts it will feed. Hill's treatment of fear is sweeping and sometimes too absolute, especially when he speaks about illness and poverty. A careful summary should not pretend every condition is imagined. But Hill's operational target is still real. Fear narrows attention, delays decisions, feeds alibis, and makes a person rehearse defeat before acting. To outwit fear is to interrupt that rehearsal and replace it with a definite decision. Chapter 16. The Devil's Workshop. After the 6 fears, Hill adds one more enemy: susceptibility to negative influences. He calls it more subtle and often more fatal than fear because it usually enters unnoticed. Sometimes it comes through discouraging relatives or friends. Sometimes it rises from one's own mental attitude. Its weapon is only a state of mind, which makes it harder to fight than an obvious external threat. The protection is willpower turned into habit. Close the mind against people who depress or discourage you. Seek the company of people who influence you to think and act for yourself. Stop expecting trouble because expectations are often obedient. Hill then gives a long self-analysis test, a set of questions about complaints, envy, self-pity, wasted time, occupation, worry, associates, purpose, fears, autosuggestion, and the people who influence you most. The exercise is blunt because the final enemy is self-deception. People build alibis for failure and then defend them because the alibi is their own creation. Hill lists the famous if-only excuses: if only I had money, education, time, health, luck, the right people, a better past, a chance. The greatest alibi is the one that almost tells the truth: if only I had the courage to see myself as I really am. The book closes with the master key: a burning desire for a definite form of riches, protected by control of thought. Time is the opponent across the board. Indecision loses moves. The answer is to start. That ending brings the secret back to earth. The master key is not a phrase hidden somewhere in the book. It is a disciplined mental posture. Know what you want, commit to giving value for it, plan with others, persist through defeat, protect the mind, and stop excusing inaction. The last chapter is Hill's final demand that the reader trade alibis for self-command.